Qur'an, chapter 63, Surah Al-Munāfiqūn, Hypocrites, by Sayyid Qutb, translation by Muhammad Al-Amrani, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. When the hypocrites come to you, O Prophet, they say, "We bear witness that you are indeed God's messenger." But God knows that you are truly his messenger, and God bears witness that the hypocrites are indeed liars. They have made their oaths a shield for themselves, and thus they turn others away from the path of God. Evil indeed is what they do. This is because they have believed, and then they have rejected faith. And so a seal has been set on their hearts, and thus they do not understand. And when you behold them, their outward appearance pleases you, and when they speak, you listen to their words. But they are like hollow pieces of timber propped up against a wall. They think that every shout is directed against them. They are the real enemies, so beware of them. May God destroy them. How perverted are their minds. And when it is said to them, "Come, so that the messenger of God may pray for your forgiveness," they turn their heads aside, and you see them turning away in arrogance. It is all the same for them, whether you pray for them or do not pray for them. God will never forgive them. Verily, God does not guide such iniquitous people. They are the ones who say, "Do not spend on those who are with the messenger of God, so that they may disperse and abandon him." Yet the treasures of the heavens and the earth belong to God, but the hypocrites do not understand. They say, "When we return to Medina, the mighty ones will surely drive out the weaker ones." But all might and honor belong to God and to his messenger and to the believers, though the hypocrites do not know. O you who have attained to faith, let neither your wealth nor your children distract you from the remembrance of God. For those who do so, it is they who are the losers. And spend in charity out of what we have provided for you before death comes to any of you. And he then says, "O my sustainer, if only you would grant me respite for a short while, I would give in charity and be among the righteous." But never will God grant respite to a soul when its term has come. And God is fully aware of all that you do. This surah, which bears the distinctive title of the Hypocrites, indicating its subject matter, is not the only surah in the Qur'an that mentions hypocrisy and hypocrites, describing their conditions and plots. In fact, hardly any Medinan surah is devoid of a reference to the hypocrites, whether through allusion or direct mention. However, this particular surah seems almost exclusively concerned with the hypocrites, alluding to certain incidents and statements attributed to them, and recounting their actions. It contains a fierce denunciation of the hypocrites' morals, lies, intrigues and manoeuvres, and of the malice and hatred they harboured against the Muslims. It also exposes their cowardice and the blindness of their hearts and minds. Other than this, the surah concludes with a brief admonition to the believers, warning them against allowing any trace of hypocrisy, even in its most subtle forms, to cling to them. The lowest degree of hypocrisy is a failure to devote oneself wholly to God and a neglect of his remembrance due to preoccupation with wealth and children, or reluctance to spend in God's cause until the day comes when giving and charity will no longer be of any avail. The hypocritical movement began with the advent of Islam in Medina and continued until shortly before the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him. It never truly ceased, though its manifestations and methods varied from time to time. This movement had a significant impact on the history and events of that period, occupying much of the Muslims' time, effort, and energy. It is mentioned in the Qur'an and the prophetic traditions many times, reflecting the magnitude of this phenomenon and its profound effect on the early Muslim community. A fine discussion of this phenomenon can be found in The Life of the Prophet, Scenes Drawn from the Qur'an by Muhammad Izzat Dawaza, from which we excerpt the following insightful passages. The reason for the emergence of this movement in Medina is clear. In Mecca, the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the early Muslims were not in a position of strength or influence that would prompt certain people to fear them or hope for their favour, causing them to feign allegiance while secretly conspiring against them. This was the general attitude of the hypocrites. In Mecca, the pagan leaders openly opposed the Prophet, subjecting those Muslims they could reach to severe persecution. They resisted the call of Islam by every means available to them, without any need for subterfuge or hypocrisy. They possessed the upper hand, to the extent that the Muslims were forced to flee to Abyssinia and then to Yathrib, Medina, in order to escape the torment. Some Muslims were even coerced into renouncing their faith under the pressure of violence or seduction, while others wavered in their resolve and aligned themselves with the polytheists. Some, like those who remained steadfast, even perished under the duress of torture. However, in Medina the situation was entirely different. Before migrating, the Prophet had already gained the support of powerful allies from the tribes of Aws and Khazraj. He did not make the hijrah until he had secured his position, and by then there was hardly a household in Medina that had not embraced Islam. In such circumstances, it was not easy for those who remained unconvinced, whether out of ignorance, malice, or envy, because they saw the Prophet's arrival as a threat to their own influence and power, to openly oppose him or the Muslim community of the emigrants and the helpers. Tribal loyalty also played a part, as the majority of the Aws and Khazraj had become supporters of the Prophet, bound to him by pacts of protection and allegiance. Many had sincerely embraced Islam and came to see the Prophet as God's messenger, their supreme leader, deserving of their obedience and guidance. Consequently, those who were still dominated by polytheism, whose hearts were hardened by arrogance and envy, and who opposed the Prophet's mission and authority, found themselves unable to express their hostility openly. Instead, they resorted to hypocrisy, outwardly professing Islam, performing its rituals and aligning themselves with their tribes. Their plots and schemes became veiled by deceit and trickery. When circumstances allowed, they sometimes adopted more overtly hostile positions, marked by clear signs of hypocrisy, particularly in times of crisis. They justified their actions under the pretext of prudence or logic, claiming to act in the best interest of the community. Nonetheless, they never openly acknowledged their disbelief or duplicity. However, the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the sincere among his companions from both the emigrants and the helpers, were not blind to their hypocrisy and plots. The Quranic revelations frequently exposed their treachery, revealing their evil intentions and warning the Prophet and his followers of their danger at every turn. The hypocrites' actions had far-reaching consequences, as the Medinan revelations suggest, to the point where their struggle against the Prophet recalls the opposition he faced from the leaders of Mecca, though the circumstances and outcomes were different. The Prophet gradually consolidated his position, his power grew, and Islam's sphere of influence expanded. He became a figure of authority. His commands carried weight, and his leadership was firmly established. The hypocrites, meanwhile, never formed a unified or influential group, and their numbers and influence diminished in direct proportion to the Prophet's increasing strength and the growing spread of Islam. One only needs to consider the significance of the hypocrites' role, especially in the early years, to appreciate the gravity of the threat they posed. They were relatively strong, supported by tribal loyalties that still held considerable sway over the majority of their kin. Moreover, they had not yet been fully exposed, and Islam had not yet taken deep root in the hearts of the masses. The Prophet was still surrounded by hostile polytheists, particularly in Mecca, where the Quraysh, his most bitter foes, continually plotted against him. The Jewish tribes in and around Medina had already distanced themselves from him from an early stage, openly declaring their enmity. Before long, the hypocrites entered into a natural alliance with the Jews, uniting in their opposition and conspiring together. So much so that one could say the hypocrites' strength and persistence in their plots were largely due to the support they received from the Jews. Their influence only began to wane after God granted the Prophet victory over his enemies and shielded him from their harm. This surah begins by describing the hypocrites' method of concealing their disbelief while openly claiming to be Muslims, professing that the Prophet is indeed God's messenger and swearing false oaths to deceive the believers and hide their true nature. When the hypocrites come to you, they say, "We bear witness that you are indeed God's messenger, but God knows that you are truly his messenger, and God bears witness that the hypocrites are indeed liars. They have made their oaths a shield, and thus they turn others away from the path of God. Evil indeed is what they do. Thus they would come to the Prophet, professing their faith in his message with their tongues, not out of sincerity, but as a form of deception, hoping to conceal their true intentions from the believers. But God declares them to be liars. After first confirming the truth of the Prophet's mission, God knows that you are truly his messenger. This careful phrasing prevents any misunderstanding that might arise from the apparent contradiction in the hypocrite's statement. The point is not to deny the truth of the message itself, but to expose the insincerity of the hypocrite's profession. They did not truly believe in the message they professed. They used their oaths as a shield, implying that they frequently swore oaths whenever their plots were uncovered or rumors about their treachery spread. They would take these oaths to protect themselves from the consequences of their actions, making their oaths a shield behind which they could continue their deceit and treachery, misleading the believers. They turned others away from the path of God, not only by turning themselves away, but by misleading others with their lies and false promises. How evil indeed is such deceit and treachery! This condition of theirs, of false testimony, deceptive oaths, and turning others away from God's path, is explained by the fact that they had initially believed, but then rejected faith. This is because they have believed, and then they have rejected faith, and so a seal has been set on their hearts, and thus they do not understand. They had known faith, but they chose to return to disbelief, and no heart that has truly known faith and then returns to disbelief is capable of understanding or insight. For who, having known the beauty and truth of faith, having experienced the clarity and sweetness of belief, would willingly return to the darkness and emptiness of disbelief, except for a heart that is utterly sealed and deadened? God has set a seal on their hearts, so they are incapable of understanding. Then, the Quranic discourse paints a unique and brilliantly crafted image, one that evokes mockery, derision, and scorn for this despicable, debased type of people, who are marked by emptiness, cowardice, fear, hatred, and ingratitude. The imagery sets them up as an object of ridicule in the grand theatre of existence. And when you see them, their appearance pleases you, and when they speak, you listen to their words. They are like propped-up pieces of wood. They think that every shout is directed at them. They are the real enemies, so beware of them. May God destroy them. How perverted are their minds! They are bodies that please the eye, but they are not truly human, for there is no genuine response from them. As long as they remain silent, they appear to be pleasing bodies to behold. But once they speak, they reveal themselves to be hollow, devoid of any meaning, understanding, or feeling. You listen to their words as if they are nothing more than empty timber. But they are not just any timber. They are like timbers propped up against a wall, lifeless and immobile. This stagnant, cold inertia reflects the state of their souls, if indeed they have souls. On the other hand, they are in a constant state of suspicion, fear, and perpetual unease. They think that every shout is directed at them. They know that they are hypocrites hiding behind a thin veil of pretense, false oaths, and deceit. And they constantly live in fear that at any moment they might be exposed, that their cover might be blown. The verse portrays them as always looking over their shoulders, nervous at every movement, every sound, every voice, thinking it is aimed at them, fearing that their true nature has been uncovered. While they are like lifeless pieces of timber when it comes to spiritual understanding and the subtle stirrings of faith, they are like trembling reeds in the wind when it comes to the fear of losing their wealth and their lives. Thus, they represent the Prophet's and the Muslims' most dangerous enemy. They are the real enemies, so beware of them. They are the true enemy, lurking within the camp, hiding amongst the ranks, and they are far more dangerous than any external, open enemy, so beware of them. Yet the Prophet, peace be upon him, was not commanded to kill them. Rather, he was instructed to deal with them in another way, one full of wisdom, restraint, and trust in being protected from their schemes, as will be illustrated by the following examples. May God destroy them. How perverted are their minds! God will fight them wherever they turn and however they are diverted. This invocation from God is a judgment, a decree that will be carried out without fail, and this is indeed what ultimately transpired. The discourse continues to describe their actions, which reveal the corruption in their hearts and their plotting against the Prophet. Peace be upon him, as well as their lies when confronted. These are traits that the hypocrites were notorious for. And when it is said to them, "Come, so that the messenger of God may pray for your forgiveness," they turn their heads aside, and you see them turning away in arrogance. It is all the same for them, whether you pray for them or do not pray for them. God will never forgive them. Verily, God does not guide such iniquitous people. They are the ones who say, "Do not spend on those who are with the messenger of God, so that they may disperse and abandon him." Yet the treasures of the heavens and the earth belong to God. But the hypocrites do not understand. They say, "When we return to Medina, the mighty ones will surely drive out the weak." But all might and honour belong to God and to his messenger and to the believers, though the hypocrites do not know. It has been related by more than one of the early scholars that this entire passage was revealed concerning Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul. Ibn Ishaq provides further detail about this, recounting the events that occurred during the expedition against Banu al-Mustalik in the 6th year of the Hijrah, at the well of Al-Muraisi. After the battle, while the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his companions were encamped at that well, the people came to draw water. Among them was Umar ibn al-Khattab, whose servant from the tribe of Banu Gifar, named Jaja ibn Mas'ud, was leading his horse. Jaja clashed at the water with Sinan ibn Wabr al-Juhani, an ally of the Banu Auf ibn al-Khazraj. A fight broke out between them, and al-Juhani cried out, "O people of the Ansar," while Jaja called out, "O people of the Muhajirin." Hearing this, Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, who was present with a group of his people, including the young Zayd ibn Arqam, became furious and said, "Have they done it? Have they dared to challenge us and outnumber us in our own land? By God, we and these garments of Quraysh are like the saying of the ancient, 'Feed your dog, and it will eat you.' By God, if we return to Medina, the strong will surely drive out the weak." Then, turning to those around him, he added, "This is what you have brought upon yourselves. You allowed them into your land and shared your wealth with them. By God, had you held back your hands from them, they would have gone elsewhere." Zayd ibn Arqam heard this and went to the Prophet, peace be upon him, who had just returned from his campaign. He informed him of what he had heard in the presence of Umar ibn al-Khattab. Umar immediately said, "O Messenger of God, let Abad ibn Bishr go and kill him." But the Prophet, peace be upon him, replied, "How would it be, O Umar, if people were to say that Muhammad kills his own companions? No, rather give the order to break camp." This was at a time when the Prophet, peace be upon him, was not accustomed to travelling. Nonetheless, he gave the command to depart, and the people began to move. Meanwhile, Abdullah ibn Ubay went to the Prophet, peace be upon him. Upon hearing that Zayd had reported him, he swore by God, saying, "I did not say what he claimed, nor did I utter such words." He was a man of high standing among his people, and some of the Ansar who were present with the Prophet said, "O Messenger of God, perhaps the boy was mistaken in what he heard, and did not accurately recall what the man said," wishing to defend Abdullah ibn Ubay. Ibn Ishaq adds that when the Prophet, peace be upon him, had mounted and begun his journey, he was met by Usaid ibn Hudayr, who greeted him with the greeting of prophecy and said, "O Prophet of God, by God you have set out at an unusual hour, one at which you are not accustomed to travelling." The Prophet, peace be upon him, responded, "Have you not heard what your companion said?" Usaid asked, "Which companion, O Messenger of God?" The Prophet replied, "Abdullah ibn Ubay." Usaid asked, "And what did he say?" The Prophet answered, "He claimed that when he returns to Medina, the strong will surely drive out the weak." Usaid said, "By God, O Messenger of God, you will be the one to drive him out if you so wish. He is the weak one, and you are the honoured one. But, O Messenger of God, treat him gently, for God brought you to us at a time when his people were stringing beads to crown him king. He now sees that you have deprived him of his kingship." The Prophet, peace be upon him, continued to march with the people through the day and into the night until they were exhausted by the heat of the sun. Finally, he allowed them to stop, and as soon as they touched the ground, they fell asleep. The Prophet, peace be upon him, had done this to distract them from what had transpired the previous day concerning Abdullah ibn Ubay. Ibn Ishaq relates that it was then that the surah concerning the hypocrites was revealed, referring to Ibn Ubay and those like him. After this revelation, the Prophet, peace be upon him, took hold of Zayd ibn Arqam's ear and said, "This is the one who has been faithful to God with his ear." When Abdullah, the son of Abdullah ibn Ubay, heard of what had happened with his father, he approached the Prophet, peace be upon him, and said, "O Messenger of God, I have heard that you intend to kill Abdullah ibn Ubay for what has reached you about him. If you are going to do so, then I ask that you give the order to me, and I will bring you his head. For the Khazraj know that there is no one more dutiful to his father than I. But I fear that if you order someone else to kill him, I will not be able to bear seeing the man who killed my father walking among the people, and I may kill him, and in doing so slay a believer for the sake of a disbeliever, thereby entering the fire." The Prophet, peace be upon him, replied, "Rather, we will continue to treat him kindly and maintain good relations with him as long as he remains with us." From that point on, whenever Abdullah ibn Ubay caused trouble, his own people were the first to reproach him, reprimand him, and speak harshly to him. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said to Umar ibn al-Khattab when he heard about this, "What do you think now, O Umar? By God, if I had killed him when you suggested it, many would have protested, but if I were to command them to kill him today, they would surely do it." Umar replied, "By God, I know that the Messenger of God's decision is far more blessed than my own." Ikrimah and Ibn Zayd, among others, also recount that when the people were returning to Medina, Abdullah, the son of Abdullah ibn Ubay, stood at the city gate with his sword drawn, preventing anyone from passing. When his father, Abdullah ibn Ubay, arrived, he said to him, "Step back." His father asked, "What's wrong with you? Woe unto you." To which his son replied, "By God, you will not pass here until the Messenger of God gives you permission, for he is the honoured one, and you are the disgraced one." When the Prophet, peace be upon him, arrived, having been travelling at the rear, Abdullah ibn Ubay complained to him about what his son had done. The son then said, "By God, O Messenger of God, he will not enter until you give him permission." The Prophet, peace be upon him, granted permission, and Abdullah said to his father, "Now that the Messenger of God has given you permission, you may pass." As we look at these events, the people involved and the Quranic text, we find ourselves immersed in the Prophet's biography, in the divine educational method, and in the wondrous decrees of God as they unfold. This is the Muslim community within which hypocrites managed to blend in, living among them during the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, for nearly 10 years. Yet the Prophet, peace be upon him, did not expel them from the community, and God did not reveal their identities to him except shortly before his death. Although he could recognize them through their speech, their evasiveness and duplicity, and through the signs on their faces and the emotions and impressions that appeared on them, God's wisdom was that people's hearts should not be entrusted to other people. Only God knows what lies within the hearts, and only He holds people accountable for what is within. As for human beings, they are to judge by outward appearances and not to act on suspicion nor rely on intuition alone. Even when the Prophet, peace be upon him, was informed by God of the identities of those who persisted in their hypocrisy until the end of his life, he did not expel them from the community as long as they outwardly professed Islam and performed its obligations. He confided this knowledge to only one of his companions, Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, without spreading it among the Muslims. Even Umar, may God be pleased with him, would go to Hudayfa to ask whether the Prophet, peace be upon him, had named him among the hypocrites. Hudayfa would simply reply, "No, Umar, you are not among them," and say no more. The Prophet, peace be upon him, instructed that prayers should not be offered for any of the hypocrites after their death, and his companions understood this command when they saw him refuse to lead the funeral prayer for someone. After the Prophet's death, Hudayfa would not pray over anyone whom he knew to be among the hypocrites, and Umar would not lead the prayer unless he saw Hudayfa present. If he did not see him, he would refrain from praying without saying anything. Thus, events unfolded as decreed by God's wisdom, serving their purpose in education, reflection, and the building of character, systems, and manners. This incident, which occasioned the revelation of these verses, is itself full of lessons and moral insights. Here we have Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul living among the Muslims, close to the Prophet, peace be upon him, witnessing the unfolding events and revelations that attested to the truth of this religion and the veracity of the messenger. Yet God did not guide his heart to faith, for he was not destined for this mercy and blessing. A deep resentment in his heart, a grudge that he had not been crowned king over the Aws and Khazraj due to the arrival of the Prophet with Islam in Medina, prevented him from receiving guidance, even though he was surrounded by the signs of Islam and its radiant influence in Yathrib. And here we have his son, Abdullah, a noble example of a sincere and devoted believer. He was tormented by his father's actions, embarrassed by his father's behavior, and ashamed of his father's stances. Yet, as a dutiful and compassionate son, he still held affection for his father. Upon hearing that the Prophet intended to kill his father, his heart was torn by conflicting emotions and sentiments, which he faced with honesty, strength, and clarity. He loved Islam, he loved obeying the Prophet, and he was willing to carry out the Prophet's command, even if it meant killing his own father. But he could not bear the thought of someone else striking his father's neck and then walking the earth in his sight. He feared that his own soul might betray him, that he might not be able to suppress the tribal instinct of revenge. So he turned to his prophet and leader, seeking help in managing the turmoil in his heart and asking to be spared from this inner torment. He requested that, if the Prophet were determined to kill his father, he be the one to carry out the execution, so that no one else would do it. He would bring the Prophet his father's head, lest he be forced to see someone else walking the earth after having killed his father. He kills a believer for the sake of an unbeliever, and thus enters the fire. It is a moment of awe that confronts the heart, no matter where one turns or where one casts one's glance in this noble scene. It is the awe of faith in the heart of a man who presents himself before the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, offering to take upon himself the most arduous task for the human soul, to kill his own father. And he is sincere in his offer, seeking to avoid what he sees as an even greater and more unbearable burden, that his human instincts might compel him to kill a believer for the sake of an unbeliever, and thus enter the fire. It is the magnificence of truthfulness and honesty as this man confronts his own human weakness toward his father, saying, "By God, the Khazraj know that no man was more dutiful to his father than I." Yet he asks his prophet and leader to assist him in overcoming this weakness, to relieve him from this burden, not by cancelling or changing the command, for the command is to be obeyed and the instruction is to be carried out, but by allowing him to be the one to bring his father's head. The noble messenger, peace and blessings be upon him, sees the distress of this believing soul and with grace and dignity relieves him of it. Rather, we shall deal with him kindly and be good to him as long as he remains among us. And before this, he had restrained Umar ibn al-Khattab, may God be pleased with him, from his opinion. But how, O Umar, will it be when people say that Muhammad kills his own companions? Then the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, acted with the wisdom of an inspired leader. He ordered the people to march at an unusual hour, continuing the march until they were utterly exhausted, so as to divert them from the foul tribalism that had been stirred by the cries of the two fighting men, "O Ansar, O Muhajirun," and to divert them also from the fitna that the hypocrite Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul sought to ignite, a fitna that could have burned away the unique bond of love and brotherhood between the Ansar and the Muhajirun, a bond unparalleled in the history of faith and in the history of humanity. The Prophet's conversation with Usaid ibn Hudayr, in which he stirred spiritual resolve against the fitna and urged him to restrain its instigator, is a conversation with a man who, despite having embraced Islam, still held a position of influence among his people. Finally, we stand before the magnificent closing scene, the scene of the believing man, Abdullah ibn Ubay, taking up his sword and blocking the entrance to Medina, preventing his father from entering. He does this in fulfillment of his own words: "The mightier will drive out the more humiliated." He wanted his father to know that the messenger of God is the mightier one, and that he himself, Abdullah, is the more humiliated. He stood there blocking the way until the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, arrived and gave permission for his father to enter. Thus, through this real-life experience, it was made clear who was the mightier and who was the humiliated. Right there, in the same incident and at the same time. What a lofty pinnacle of faith it was that raised those men to such heights. Faith lifted them to this summit, even though they were still human beings, with all the weaknesses, emotions, and instincts of humanity. This is the most beautiful and truthful aspect of this creed. When it is truly grasped by people, and when they themselves become its living embodiment, walking upon the earth as human beings who eat food and walk in the markets, then we live under the shade of the Quranic verses that envelop these events, and when it is said to them, "Come, the messenger of God will ask forgiveness for you," they turn their heads aside, and you see them turning away in arrogance. They commit the deed, and they utter the words. But when they realize that the news has reached the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, they become cowardly and hesitant, swearing oaths to shield themselves. But when someone says to them, "Come, the messenger of God will ask forgiveness for you," and they are safe from facing him directly, they turn their heads away in arrogance and pride. These are two traits that are inseparable in the hypocritical soul. This behavior often comes from those who hold some position or standing among their people, yet within themselves they are too weak to face confrontation. They are proud and haughty when they feel safe from confrontation, but when they are confronted, they become cowardly, hesitant, and quick to swear oaths. Thus, the address turns to the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, informing him of God's decree regarding them, regardless of what may happen, and that seeking forgiveness for them is of no avail after God's judgment. It is all the same whether you ask forgiveness for them or do not ask forgiveness for them. God will never forgive them. Verily, God does not guide the rebellious people. Then the Quran recounts part of their rebelliousness, which earned them God's judgment. They are the ones who say, "Do not spend on those who are with the messenger of God until they disperse." This statement reveals the depth of their vile nature and their inherent malice. It is a plan of starvation, a method that seems to be shared by the enemies of truth and faith throughout different times and places, in their war against the creed and in their opposition to religion. Out of the meanness of their souls, they think that sustenance is the most important thing in life, just as it is in their own perception, and so they wage war against the believers with it. It was the same plan that Quraysh devised when they boycotted the clan of Banu Hashim, hoping that they would abandon their support for the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, and hand him over to the polytheists. It was the same plan that the hypocrites devised, as recounted in this verse, hoping that the companions of the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, would abandon him under the pressure of hardship and hunger. It is the same plan that the communists used to deprive the religious in their lands of ration cards, so they would either die of hunger or renounce their faith, abandoning their prayers. And it is the same plan that others employ in their war against the call to God and the Islamic revival in Muslim lands through blockade, starvation, and attempts to cut off the means of livelihood and sustenance. Thus, all the enemies of faith, from ancient times to modern times, converge upon this ignoble method. Forgetting the simple truth that the Quran reminds them of at the end of this verse, "And to God belong the treasures of the heavens and the earth, but the hypocrites do not understand." It is from God's treasures in the heavens and the earth that those who try to control the sustenance of the believers are themselves sustained. They do not create their own sustenance. How foolish and ignorant they are, thinking that they can cut off the provision of others. Thus, God strengthens the believers and fortifies their hearts against this vile plan and despicable method which God's enemies resort to in their war. He reassures them that the treasures of the heavens and the earth belong to God, and that these are the sources of sustenance for all. If God provides for his enemies, he will surely not forget his allies. In his mercy he has decreed that even his enemies among his servants will not be punished through starvation or deprivation of sustenance. For he knows that they cannot provide for themselves, not even the smallest amount, if he were to withhold provision from them. Only the lowest of the low, the vilest of the vile, would devise a plan of starvation. Then comes their final statement. They say, if we return to Medina, the mightier will surely drive out the more humiliated. And we have seen how Abdullah ibn Ubay fulfilled this, how the humiliated one did not enter the city except with the permission of the mightier one. To God belongs all honor, and to his messenger, and to the believers, but the hypocrites do not know. God the Almighty aligns his messenger and the believers with himself, bestowing upon them a share of his honor. This is a tremendous honor, one that only God can bestow. What honor can be greater than to have God, glorified and exalted is he, align his messenger and the believers with himself, saying, here we are. This is the banner of the honorable. This is the rank of the honored. And God speaks the truth, for he has made honor the companion of faith in the heart of the believer, an honor derived from God's own majesty. It is an honor that never weakens, never bends, never bows, and never softens. It never departs from the heart of the believer, except when faith begins to falter. But when faith is firm and deeply rooted, honor remains steadfast and unshakable alongside it. But the hypocrites do not know. How could they know when they do not taste this honor, nor are they connected to its true source? To these believers whom God has placed in his ranks alongside his messenger, peace and blessings be upon him, and to whom he has granted honor from his own honor, God now addresses the final call in this surah. He calls them to rise to this noble station, to distance themselves from any trait resembling the traits of the hypocrites, and to choose that highest rank over wealth and children, so that they may not be distracted by them from attaining that radiant position. O you who believe, let not your wealth or your children divert you from the remembrance of God. And whoever does that, it is they who are the losers. And spend in charity from what we have provided for you before death approaches one of you, and he says, my sustainer, if only you would delay me for a brief term so I could give in charity and be among the righteous. But God will never delay a soul when its time has come, and God is fully aware of what you do. Wealth and children are distractions and preoccupations if the heart is not awake, if it does not grasp the purpose of existence, if it does not feel that it has a higher aim befitting the creature into whom God breathed his spirit, and endowed with a longing to attain some of his divine attributes within the limits of human capacity. God has granted him wealth and children to carry out his role as a vicegerent on earth, not to distract him from remembering God and connecting with the source from which he received his humanity. Whoever neglects this connection and allows wealth and children to distract him from the remembrance of God, which sustains this connection, will surely be among the losers. The first thing they will lose is this very quality of being human, for it is contingent upon the connection with the source that made them human in the first place. Whoever loses themselves has lost everything, no matter how much wealth or how many children they possess. Then, in a single verse, the Qur'an touches upon the subject of spending in God's cause from multiple angles, and spend from what we have provided for you. This reminds them of the source of the sustenance they have in their hands. It comes from God, in whom they believe and who commands them to spend from it. Before death approaches one of you, and suddenly they leave everything behind for others, realizing too late that they have not prepared anything for themselves. This is the height of folly and the greatest of losses. Then they will wish and plead for a delay so they might give in charity and be among the righteous. But how could that happen? But God will never delay a soul when its time has come. How could they offer what they failed to give before, now that their time is up? And God is fully aware of what you do. These are the varied touches within a single verse, placed perfectly after the depiction of the hypocrites' traits and their schemes against the believers. The believers, having sought refuge in God's ranks, which shield them from the hypocrites' plots, are now called upon to rise to the responsibilities of faith, never neglecting the remembrance of God, the source of all security. Thus does God nurture the Muslims with this noble Qur'an.